What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Expeditions Rome, the recently released TRPG, though personally I would say it's a bit of a CRPG as well, but that is to say an isometric game that focuses a lot on tactical combat. Now before we jump into the rest of it, a few things to get out of the way. One, I like to review games after 100% because I feel it lends some credibility to what I do, as well as simply sets me apart from other reviewers on YouTube. That said, if you're wondering about everything I cover in these reviews and you're new to my channel, if you just click on my channel, the first video you're going to see if you're not subscribed is a video explaining what all I cover in these reviews, which does include the achievements, of course, but also includes a lot of other things. My Steam profile is public and linked in the description below if you're interested in checking that out. Feel free to do so. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this here. Expeditions Rome is the third installment of the Expedition series, the previous titles being Conquistador and Viking. So starting off, let's talk about a few things surrounding the story and the setup. For starters, kind of hard to spoil a story that kind of hinges around historical events, but nonetheless, I will try to avoid major plot spoilers. But to give an explanation here, in my opinion, this game is best described story-wise as a what-if scenario where you replace Julius Caesar. In fact, you can meet Julius Caesar pretty early on, and he dies unceremoniously in battle as a young man, which is obviously not what happened in real life, and thus you kind of wind up taking his place across a few different war campaigns that the game encompasses. That is to say, the war campaign in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, a war campaign in Egypt, which sees you meeting such figures as Cleopatra and Ptolemy, and it ends with the third act in the war against Gaul. Now, it's important to know that with this what-if scenario, they've taken a bit of artistic license. So while things like the culture and setting of Rome were attempted to be fairly faithfully recreated in some manner, or at least as best you can in a video game, obviously, some stuff was just given some artistic license. For instance, Act 2 is Egypt and Act 3 is the Gallic campaign. However, in real life, the war with Gaul happened well before the stuff with Cleopatra that happens in-game. But beyond the actual war campaigns, there is a more personal subplot that revolves around you and your family and some conspiracies going on in the Roman Senate, which is fun and also completely made up. But to say it again, this is a sort of what-if scenario. But nonetheless, some of the choices available to you in the war campaigns are things that Julius Caesar actually did. You can fairly faithfully recreate how Julius Caesar reacted and dealt with a lot of these problems if you wanted to. And the last thing I want to mention about the story is I think you should play through the game twice at the very least if you want to see as much as possible, because if you choose to play through the campaign as a woman, there's a ton of dialogue and framing that changes a vast deal, actually, because of course women in ancient Roman times were not treated the same way that men were, and certainly weren't seen leading armies, that type of stuff. And as such, the framing around things like that, allowing for those choices, I thought led to a lot of interesting changes to the campaign that made it pretty noticeably different than a first playthrough. From there, let's talk about difficulty. So the difficulty ranges from easy and insane, and then we have difficulty setting options that are separate from the actual difficulty setting. Those being combat death and Iron Man. So combat death will basically mean any character that is incapacitated has 4 turns before they bleed out and die, provided you have this turned on. If you have it turned off, characters will still be incapacitated. However, they just don't have the rounds until death counting down. But if this is turned on, you have 4 rounds to either stabilize a target, that is to say your incapacitated character, via bandages or the aid skill, or revive them flat out, as there's a skill to do that as well. Otherwise, they bleed out and are officially dead. Now, there are other ways for the characters to die, but we'll get into that. And then Iron Man is actually a really lax Iron Man mode, to be honest. So Iron Man forces you to keep 1 save. However, it is not deleted if you die. But because it is possible to play the game and get yourself stuck on Iron Man, it's technically possible to lose a run on Iron Man. But again, you're only forced to keep 1 save file, but it does not self-delete upon being defeated. So it's really not as stringent as a lot of other ones. And then, of course, there's the actual difficulty settings. Personally, I found normal to be pretty easy, honestly, but I do play a ton of these games. So for the most part, what I'd recommend is play through the game once on normal to kind of get a feel for the combat and the classes and stuff, all of which I've made videos for, so I'll probably try to link those down below as well. But after kind of getting a feel for it, then I'd recommend honestly jumping up to either hard or insane. But the primary differences between the difficulties is the amount of health the enemy has combined with how much damage they do. So they have more health, better gear, which means they do more damage. Plus the AI is just smarter on insane mode. They will go after weaker characters, they will use tactical items, which is like consumables, etc. Whereas on normal, they don't really do that nearly as much. Now, when it comes to character creation, it is pretty basic, honestly. There's a kind of a fun thing around Roman names where they had 3 names, like a lot of modern people do, but they meant different things. So like your middle name is your family name, and your last name is like a nickname that your friends call you. And your first name is just your like official name that your superior would talk to you with. However, if you play as a female character, women don't get first names in Roman society, so that's a whole thing as well. But the actual character creation options are pretty basic again, but that said, you're not going to be close up on your character very often, because this is an isometric game. Now, from here you'll choose 4 classes, but you won't do it right at character creation. You actually have to play through the small combat tutorial, and then you get to pick your class. There are 4 classes. I've made a pretty comprehensive guide about those classes, so I'll link that down below rather than go over them again. But this is a realistic setting, so while there is a ton of build depth, and they did quite a lot with what is essentially just sword and board and things like pikes and an archer class, nonetheless, there's a good amount of depth to the classes, but you will choose that after character creation. So from here, let's talk a bit about world building. The game itself is kind of linear, meaning that you can approach each war campaign pretty much how you want. Some of the quests have to be done in order, but besides that, you're pretty much free to navigate the war campaign however you please. But once you're done with the war campaign, there's a small intermission between them, and then you move on to the next one, and there's no real going back, as you might imagine. The story itself takes place over like 10 or 15 years, give or take. So that's something to keep in mind as well, I suppose. Now, after the initial prologue, if you will, you're given control of a Roman legion, which is what you're going to use to fight battles and conquer territory with. And while that is how you'll actually move through the war campaign, it's how you'll battle other legions, etc., which uses this sort of almost text event battle style, which I thought was a little underwhelming for the actual army battles. But it's kind of how you do it. You'll scout out sectors of the map, you'll find the capital there, and then you'll send your legion to attack the army that is sitting there. And then, provided you win, you'll take over that territory, but then you'll have to pacify the territory as well, which is done through one of 2 ways. You'll either get to pacify it with your legion, or you'll have to go on a special mission. And it's actually random which one comes up. So each time you conquer a territory, you'll either get to pacify that area with your legion, or you'll get a mission specific to that territory that you will have to send actual soldiers on, and you'll get to play that battle out in an actual tactical setting, as opposed to the more text event army battles. But some of the special missions are actually really fun, because you cannot send your main character on these special missions to pacify a territory. You have to send one of your companions, which we'll go over in a bit, and then the rest is actually going to be hired praetorians, which is to say your personal guard. This is also known as hiring mercenaries in basically every other CRPG, but because hiring mercenaries means a whole separate thing in real life, what they actually are is praetorians. But these are essentially the mercs you would hire in any other game. But you'll have to send a team of these people to go on this mission to then put down the rest of the resistance and then finally pacify the territory. And then from there, you can use your legion to exploit the resources of said territory. And this is going to allow you to do things like give yourself more rations, as well as medicine, and this is going to help sustain your war effort, obviously. But more practically, it's also going to let you upgrade your war camp. As while you're doing all this, your war camp will of course move, but it's basically whatever city your legion is currently occupying, and then you'll go there, you'll get access to your war camp, where as you upgrade it, it can do a lot of various things for you. You'll get access to crafting your own items, which is very important on higher difficulties, as you need the best stuff you can get as soon as you can get it. You can also do things like replenish charges of your consumable items here for free. If any of your characters get hurt via a text event in which they sustain an injury, or they get incapacitated for a little while, which will also give them an injury, you can set them up in your war camp to be healed without costing you medicine. However, any of your characters that have a healing perk can actually perform triage, which will slowly heal these people over time as well. You can also unlock the workshop. This will unlock stratagems for you to use during your army battles, which will make them easier. But I will say, even on insane difficulty, the army battles were never at risk of really going wrong. Outside of just blatantly doing stuff you shouldn't be, the army battles are very easy, and because there is no time limit on anything in the game, it's pretty easy to just simply out-resource the enemy, even on the highest difficulty levels. So if you've got enough time, it's really not that difficult to win the war campaign stuff at all. But that said, as I mentioned, each of these war campaigns actually has main and side missions for you to do. So while your legion is out doing all the conquering of territories, you and your character and your companions, etc., will actually be going around in a more CRPG fashion, completing quests, running down the story, even performing side quests from people you can talk to and find in some of the major areas, which again makes this game a much bigger CRPG than I initially thought it was going to be. But beyond this, there's actually secrets to find, all of it set in historical settings, which is of course based on modern day areas of the world. So there's a lot of nods to historical things and real life things that are actually present in our world. So you'll see a lot of that. Basically, if you like the concept of Roman history and kind of are fascinated with that period of history itself, you'll probably enjoy the world building of this game, which, let's be real, is the main selling point, so it's kind of important. Personally, I think the game manages to draw a happy medium between embellishment and reality. I do think there are some people who are going to be put off by the kind of middle ground that this game strikes, as opposed to it just being a retelling of Roman history, period. But personally, I was pleasantly surprised with the experience in terms of the world building, and just how you go about playing this game, honestly. Now, next up, let's actually talk about the combat a little bit. So, the combat is a turn-based tactical system. If you're familiar with TRPGs, or honestly just CRPGs that are turn-based, you'll be fairly familiar with what to expect here. Now, the primary difference between a TRPG and a CRPG is really that there are extra objectives to the battles. Whereas in CRPGs, the objective is basically to just kill enemies. The objectives in TRPGs tend to be different stuff, like destroy a specific target, like burn all the lumber in one mission, for instance, or put out a fire at a temple even. And while yes, the objective is occasionally kill everything, it's much less often than you might think, which I actually enjoy because I think this adds a layer to combat that I don't necessarily play around with all the time, primarily playing CRPGs, and I got a lot of fun out of it. There's a good variety to the objectives, to the enemy types, while simultaneously not being overly complicated, which makes it a relatively good entry point into the genre. Now, that does come with one pretty big caveat, and I wanted to mention it here specifically. In every war campaign, there are a few siege battles. Siege battles are like giant tactical CRPG battles. They are multi-phase, they are multi-objective, they usually involve 3 or 4 different teams of your companions and praetorians that you are moving through. And quite frankly, I just did not enjoy them. Each one of them, there are 3 or 4 depending on exactly how you want to count it, but each of these takes a couple hours on your first time through because you're just controlling so many characters, on top of the fact that there are so many enemies that sometimes the enemy turn can just take several minutes to actually resolve itself, which means for a lot of the siege battles, you're just waiting for the enemy team to stop, and then even when it's your turn, friendly NPCs that you're not controlling also have to go. So a lot of these siege battles are just spent waiting for your turn, honestly. And then you combine that with siege battles being where you get to typically use the catapults. The catapults just let you target certain areas of the battlefield with, catapult objects such as actual stones, a firebomb, scatter shot, which is kind of like low damage but everywhere. And the problem is the enemy AI on every difficulty seems to just magically know where the catapults are going to hit, and they will go out of their way to move out of it, which means it is much, much more difficult to hit enemies with a catapult than it should be. And it feels like that specifically just does not make any sense, and it really annoyed me. Because if you could aim those catapults and enemies just didn't, again, magically seem to know where the stone was going to land, these battles would be over a lot faster. Now, there are, as I've mentioned a few times, several companions. There is Kaizo, the military veteran. There is Julia Kalida, which was actually a woman posing as a man who you meet very early on in the game. This is like beginning of the game information. I'm not spoiling anything. There is Bestia Tabat, a gladiator who fought for his freedom and is a free citizen. There is Cineros, an old Olympian who serves your family. And then lastly, there is Dayanara. Dayanara is optional, whereas the rest are pretty much handed directly to you. Dayanara is a female gladiator that you can free from her bondage in the first act if you should so choose. But that said, all of the companions, they do have a storyline to them, and they are romanceable. However, none of that gets fleshed out quite as much as I would like it to be. That's not to say they're bad. I think what's there is good. It's just that I wish it got a little more screen time overall. But who you romance and some of the choices you make will actually impact the story a decent amount as well, which is worth mentioning. But again, I just wish it got a little more chance to shine than what it did, because I was interested in the companion stories, but ultimately they're all pretty short side quests, and then the romances are usually just a bit extra dialogue, discounting the more story-specific stuff that relates to it, which without spoiling is hard to explain. But from there, let's talk some positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. Positives is obviously the combat. If you're going into this expecting a just purely TRPG, then you're not going to be disappointed. There's a lot of very tactical combat that I enjoyed learning and mastering. I thought the way that they handled the classes, despite it, basically just being real-life swordsmen and archers, had a great deal of depth to it that, again, while being fun and in-depth, is still, in my opinion, pretty easy to pick up. Another big positive is the setting. It was really cool kind of seeing, all these things you hear about Rome, etc., just kind of put into a video game so well and faithfully adhered to, so that was really cool for me. And then another big positive is actually the voice acting. The game is voice acted, which is rare for a smaller game like this, to be honest. I know voice acting is a bit of a make or break for a lot of people, especially with these types of games. And there is voice acting, and I did think it was really well done. So for me, the negatives, I would say, are the Legion battles, the Siege battles, and the Catapult AI, which are ultimately relatively minor outside of the Siege battles. The Legion battles, I guess I was a little disappointed with. I was hoping there would be more to them than this glorified text event. And, I guess technically there is. If you build the workshop in your Legion camp, you can, again, research new stratagems, but they don't really change the battles any. And you can, I actually tried this, so I know it's true. You can go through the entire game and win every battle without ever unlocking new stratagems. So it's a text event that is in no way difficult and is really just a roadblock to your enjoyment for the sake of being a roadblock. Then the other negative is that these Siege battles, at least the first time through them, are painfully slow. I wish they would find some way to speed those up a bit, because conceptually the battles really aren't that complicated. It's just that there's so many people taking so many turns that it just takes forever to resolve itself. And ultimately it took what was supposed to be a highlight and turned it into a bit of a negative. And then, of course, the Catapult AI. That really bothered me. Probably more than it will most people, but I was just like, how do these enemies just magically know where a catapult's going to hit? And I just found that really frustrating. So before we wrap up and I give a conclusion here, I did want to mention that there is supposed to be at least one DLC for this game. I don't have any real details on that, but I wanted to mention it here because in the future, when that DLC releases and somebody watches this video, they might have questions. That's why it's not here. But I believe there is one DLC planned for this. But my conclusion for this game is quite frankly that I was pleasantly surprised by it. There is so much more to this game than I was expecting. There's so many fun nods to historical tales that I don't really know if they're true or not. There's nods to things that are more mythological in nature. There's side quests that came out of left field and really surprised me and made me laugh. Some of the pacification quests are just outright references to other works of fiction, so shall we say. And when I initially picked this game up, I saw its $45 price tag on Steam, and I thought it was a little bit steep. But after playing through this game, I actually think that's a very fair price. The game itself, first playthrough for me ran about 30 hours, but talking to a few other people, I think 40 to 50 hours is probably more the general average. At least for a first playthrough. Once you know what you're doing, you can speed through here pretty quick. But again, I initially thought 45 was a little steep, but after actually playing through this game, I very much so think it's worth that money. But overall, there's a few rough edges, like I mentioned here and there, stuff that I wish was just a little more polished, but by and large, Expeditions Rome is a very fun game that had a lot more to it than I was really expecting there to be. So I would absolutely recommend it if you're curious, and chances are if you're watching this video you are. All of that said, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.